Hi there, I'm Matthew Griffith, a PhD student in Italian Studies at Harvard University, and I'm joined here today by Professor Frank Burke, Professor Emeritus at Queen's University, where he taught in film and media studies. He's here today to present his new book project, A Companion to Italian Cinema, published by Wiley-Blackwell, of which he was the main editor. Professor Burke, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
My first question today has to deal with the origin of the project. You
Mm-hmm.
dedicated the volume to Peter Brunet, who was an Italian studies scholar and a film studies scholar, and he was also a great friend of yours. Could you maybe talk to us a bit about how the project got started and what its goals were?
Yeah, well, Peter and I were friends, and he had proposed the companion to Wiley-Blackwell, and the editor had gotten in touch with me to referee the proposal. And of course, it was a great proposal because Peter was a wonderful scholar. And I also, through that process, developed a bit of a relationship with Jane Forgnoli, who was the editor of the book. And then all of a sudden, on June 16th, 2010, Peter died. He had a heart attack at the Taormina Film Festival. So after getting over the initial shock, I got in touch with Jane and said, is there some way that we could keep the project alive, partly in memory of Peter? And her relationship with Peter is very similar to mine. We both loved his geniality, his openness, and his seriousness as a professional. So she very much wanted to do that. So we moved ahead. Peter had done a lot of the preliminary work in terms of lining up contributors and so forth, but then the project went on for several years, partly because I didn't have the wisdom to take on a co-editor, and partly because life got in the way here and there. And in the end, I think the book was very much still very, very true to the spirit of what Peter had in mind, which was to provide new ways of looking at Italian cinema. And but sort of the contributors and, of course, evolution just over a 5-year period in Italian cinema studies meant that the book ended up in quite a different place from where it began. But at any rate, without Peter Brunet, this book would certainly not exist.
So one of my favorite stories from the introduction is how you and Peter always disagreed about Fellini. And I really think that we would be remiss not to mention your work outside of this project as a Fellini scholar. And in many ways, a lot of your career has been devoted to bringing Fellini out of Italian studies and into film studies more broadly in a non-national frame. My next question is about this companion to Italian cinema. How does it negotiate that idea of national boundaries within cinema studies?
Well, it's a difficult thing, and in a sense, the series raises that issue. Now, to a large extent, people talk about world cinema and, of course, globalization and so forth. And if you look at a film like Luca Guadagnino's Call Me By Your Name, it's an English-language film which has been nominated for an Oscar in Best Picture category, not Best Foreign Film category. So how do we talk about Italian cinema, national cinemas, in this kind of world of global financing and global exhibition and distribution? And I would say that that's probably one of the focal points of the book, is to try and talk about, for one thing, the fact that Italian cinema has always been transnational. It's never been just purely national. Spaghetti Western's a really good example of a popular genre that played with American models but also turned it into something very different, shot in Spain, successful in Italy. So the issue of nationality is constantly in the foreground. At the same time, the history of Italian studies has largely been a history of examinations of ideas of nationhood, because Italy was considered a latecomer nation. And so it's been very much on people's minds how to create a nation that has come together sort of late in the game in comparison with certain other European countries. So nation has been kind of an obsession, at the same time that cinema in itself has always been transnational in one way or another. So at any rate, the book deals with that in a variety of different ways.
Amazing. And if memory serves, you're also currently working on a companion specifically for Fellini, is that right?
I am. It's going to be the centenary of his birth in 2020, and we hope to have the companion out to celebrate that.
Oh, fantastic. Now, one of the guiding metaphors in your introduction is that of the bridge. And among the contributors, this volume counts Peter Bondinella, the author of the monumental History of Italian Cinema, but also scholars from Italy like Veronica Pravadelli, who's a prominent Italian gender and film theorist. What were some of the challenges and opportunities that arose from building these bridges between such contrasting approaches from both sides of the Atlantic and beyond? And then now that this volume is here, what new lines of inquiry does it make possible?
Okay, well, let me start with the first question, and I might have to ask you to repeat the second question if I've forgotten what it was. But in terms of building bridges and the kinds of work that's possible by working on both sides of the Atlantic, I think one of the interesting things that's evolved, and evolved really in the course of the project, is that there used to be fairly clear-cut distinctions or a tendency to think of Italian scholarship as being more archival and philological, and Anglo scholarship being more theoretical. And I think one of the things that's happened is there's been much more crossover. Veronica Pravidelli, for instance, studied in the United States. Vito Zagaria was another person who's a major Italian film scholar who studied in the U.S. And then, of course, Peter Bondinella just immersed himself in Italian studies as well. So I think the kinds of divisions that tended to exist historically are dissolving now. I mean, it was a wonderful opportunity for me to be able to work sort of in both places at the same time. But at any rate, I would say that the bridges have been built in a sense, and now there is a good deal of crossover. There is one unfortunate instance to me of a book that's on Fellini that's recently been published in English and doesn't take account of any English language Fellini scholarship. So there are still times in which you feel that for lack of translation, for one thing, that people aren't consulting both Italian and Anglo scholarship at the same time. But generally speaking, I think that kind of thing is dissolving.
Okay, well, maybe we could build off that a little bit more and just talk a bit about how this volume specifically paves the way for new developments in these fields.
Well, I think one of the areas that's addressed in the book, but not in great detail, is the influence of the internet and sort of the changes in exhibition and distribution made possible by the internet. And I think that's one of the things that's happened is that film studies has now become a part of screen studies, but basically it's all part of visual studies, and visual studies obviously in a digital age.
And that's especially relevant to us here at Harvard with our Department of Visual Studies.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think there's much more to be done in terms of the digitalization of cinema and the effect it's had and the possibilities it creates for new work. And the limits that it creates for new work as well. One of the things that sort of intrigues me, and I wish in a way there were more discussion of it in the book, is the question of pleasure. What are the pleasures of Italian cinema? And certainly I was drawn to it because I derived enormous pleasure from it in the 1960s and 1970s. And there's been a tendency in mainstream Anglo criticism and theory to devalue Italian film because it's too pretty. Because there's a sense that film is seductive and we have to back off the seduction to understand what the ideological conditioning is and all that. But I think what's been lost is something very specific to Italian film, which is that strong sense of the aesthetic. And I think there's been a return, in a way, to discussing issues like the haptic or tactile quality of cinema, the physicality of it. So that's something that I would like to see developed in the future, is to sort of, in a way, bring fun back, not in a trivial way, but bring a strong sense of pleasure back to the experience of watching film and writing about it.
Mm-hmm. No, and that reminds me, we were talking earlier about how you mentioned the most satisfying moment of your career is when you got to provide the voiceover for the Criterion release of Fellini's Roma.
Mm-hmm. A perfect example.
The passion certainly came through there. So maybe on that note, we'll just mention that we're looking forward to seeing you next time for the Fellini Companion specifically. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Okay,
and thank you all for watching. See you next time.
Thank you very much, Matt.